LA has a 21-fold population increase from 1910 to 1970. And what it did is it took in all those millions of people while becoming progressively richer. So that means that, of course, LA was not only a growing place, but it was high quality growth. And I could contrast that today, by the way. There's a lot of growing cities out there in America. There's a lot of low quality growth. For example, many of the cities of the South and Southwest are growing, and everybody's always jealous of them, right? Because, you know, Las Vegas takes in all these people, or Phoenix, or certain of the cities in the Old South. But you have to remember, many of those metro areas today are what we might call low quality growth, because their income levels are not very high. They get people, but they don't raise incomes. The exceptions, just to give it a wider reference point, the exceptions in the South and Southeast are, well, Houston is a big exception. Houston is to the late 20th and early 21st century what LA was to the first 2/3 of the 20th, meaning it's gotten much bigger and it's a rich city now. It is high per capita income. Dallas and Atlanta, somewhat, not quite as good as Houston, but not too bad. But beyond those cases, and Austin, which is the boutique case, right? But beyond those cases, actually, we have to remember that though there is a lot of growth in quantitative terms in the South and the Intermountain West, much of it is not very high quality growth. So LA was a high quality growth place. Now, I think there's a few other things that I want to just be kind of polemical or like controversial about here, because there's sort of myths about the magic wands of economic development today. LA did not go down and San Francisco did not stay up because San Francisco had a more skilled workforce in 1970. The skills base of Southern California and Northern California were nearly identical. LA was a highly educated city with an incredible reservoir of technological engineering, finance, and management talent, just like its northern neighbor. So the Bay Area workforce today does look better than the Southern California workforce, but it's an outcome, not a cause. Now, I'm not meaning to dismiss the importance of having a high quality workforce. It's important to continuing economic growth that you already have going. But when we look at these big switching points, like the ones like Detroit and Boston or LA and San Francisco, these kind of things, the magic wand is often not because, you know, okay, the skilled people were there and that's why all the new development came to them. And our book tortures this question out in academic terms, but I think it does a pretty good proof that the skills base is more outcome than cause. So, or to put it in another, there's another kind of a chicken and egg thing we say in academia. Do people go to jobs or jobs go to people, right? The big answer in terms of these switches is that people go to jobs. It's the jobs base that counts, and that attracts the people in, or it keeps the people there who have skills. Otherwise you get them leaving, and that's what happened to Southern California. So you all know this story, right? This is kind of like anyone with a kind of reasonable consciousness of these two regions can tell the story that the Bay Area gets Silicon Valley. It refocuses finance at the high end. It's not a big financial economy, but it's a vibrant one at that end. And it gets, of course, this amazing phenomenon not only of having Silicon Valley as an entrepreneurial startup culture, but it does what we might call industry building entrepreneurship. It goes from small to big, and it gets IT-related corporate headquarters. Southern California, it loses a lot of its aerospace and defense, which is high-tech, high-wage skill base. It loses its corporate headquarters. It grows in light manufacturing, but light manufacturing is low wage. In the entertainment sector, that's the good story. Hooray for Hollywood. It does grow. It's stronger in Southern California than ever, but I'll show you why it can't support the economy. LA puts all of its bets on its port and its logistics sector, but that's a low to medium wage sector. And it does it at the right time because it gets the China trade, right? It dominates all of West Coast Trans-Pacific trade, but it doesn't raise the wages. And now it's losing out in biotech, and the Bay Area has won in biotech. This is sort of the technical story, meaning the core of these two regions' economies. LA and San Francisco have as a percentage of their economy the same size IT sectors in 1970, about 2.6 or 2.7% direct employment in the core high-tech industries. But by 2010, the Bay Area quadruples and LA stays at the same percentage. So basically, that's the loss. And I didn't say one basic point. I'm using LA and San Francisco as labels for their regions. I mean the 10-county Bay Area, and I mean the 5-county LA region. So they are comparable regions. It's just that one's twice as big as the other, but we're getting the whole regional economy. And let me make another, maybe an important point, because it comes up when people ask me about this. These differences in income, they show up even after we correct for the Bay Area's higher housing prices. So that's another myth that people have, especially in Southern California. It says, yeah, we have lower incomes, but our housing is cheaper, so people in the Bay Area really aren't better off than us. That's untrue. People in the Bay Area really are better off than people on average in Southern California. Moreover, we have the same levels of inequality. So what I mean by that is, the Bay Area and LA, the bad news is, the Bay Area and LA are highly unequal regions. They have coefficients, that is mathematical coefficients of income inequality that are very high. I could give you, I don't know how many economist types there are in the room, but they have coefficients that are over 50, what are called Gini coefficients. That makes them sort of like third world countries in terms of inequality. But the good news is that because the Bay Area is wealthier, at every level, whether you're a low-income person, a middle-income person, or a high-income person, the absolute value of your income is higher here. So better to be rich and unequal than poor and unequal, to put it a little bluntly. We're equally unequal, but one of us is richer than the other. Right? I prefer to be rich and unequal than poor and unequal. Okay, so the other thing to note is that there's a big myth. I have to deal with this one in Southern California all the time. Everyone says, yeah, but it's not our fault because the Pentagon took our jobs away after the end of the Cold War and we're victims of politics. That's not untrue. The aerospace sector really did build down. You can see there that it went from 3.4% of LA's core employment in 1970 to less than 1%. So there's a pretty big jobs reduction. You see about 60,000 direct jobs, and then there's the indirect ones that went away. However, when you do all of the, when you tease those numbers with direct and indirect jobs and everything, it's about 1/10 of the gap that opened up was because we lost aerospace. So there's a wider failure or a wider gap between the two economies, and it's not accounted for, or it's accounted for only partially by aerospace. Like I said, Hollywood is incredibly successful, but again, look at entertainment. Entertainment is 1.3% of LA's direct employment, 0.7% in 1970. It's 2.5% now. So it's grown a lot. And this is mostly high-wage employment, and that's not the indirect part. But the point is that 2.5% is not the equivalent of the Bay Area's 10.2% in IT. In other words, we have one high-wage sector that's 2.5% of our economy. You have a high-wage sector that's more than 10%, right? And then when you multiply out all of the many indirect effects of that, you get a kind of an exponentially better effect of this high-wage core that you have in the Bay Area that we no longer have in Southern California. That's the real story. Here's some, I love these kind of numbers because they haven't been developed very much. This is what happens when you dig down and you try to see what's the real inner plumbing of these economies. So what I mean there is, if you go into an industry and you take what the US government calls the same kind of job or the same kind of occupation, and these are what we in economics call very detailed categories. They're really specific kinds of work. So we're not mixing in apples and oranges. We're taking a certain kind of job. So you take, say you clone someone working in custom computer programming services in LA, and you clone them with someone in the Bay Area. The average person working in this narrow segment, this narrow kind of job, they'll make $81,000 in LA, right? And they'll make $78 in LA, and 81 in, 2000. 78 in LA, 109,000 in the Bay Area in the year 2000. You look at software copying, 96 in LA, 176 in the Bay Area. So you're basically, now think about how this works at the labor market level. You've got someone who's trained to do a certain kind of job, and they're saying, I'll go work in the Orange County IT sector and do this, my profession, or I'll go work in Silicon Valley. Which one am I going to choose based on that chart if I have the information, right? And these are astonishing, what in economics we consider these to be astonishing gaps, because economics tells us that if you're in the same kind of job, that basically you will migrate, and it'll kind of cause the wages to equalize between the two regions. It's like water sloshing around a bathtub. It'll get evener over time because you'll leave the low-wage places and go to the high-wage places. So something keeps going on in the Bay Area that pushes the wages up. Right? Now, you all know what some of that could be. It's the labor shortages, or not getting enough new people in, and so the way it's a seller's market for labor services. But it's astonishing how big the differences are and how much bigger they have gotten over time. So now this is another thing that we were able to do that I don't think anyone's ever done before. So this is me tooting my own academic horn. But there's a way now that we can transform the jobs of a region. We can determine what kind of work people are doing, and basically we can determine whether it's manual work, whether it's non-manual work, but even more specifically, we can determine what's called how much cognitive task intensity is. Cognitive task intensity is the stuff that basically is smart people using their brains, and this is what the economy pays for these days. And this is all it's kind of a fancy statistical manipulation. But what you see there in 1970. The absolute numbers won't mean much to you, so think of them in a comparative way. In the United States in 1970, the intensity of the economy as a whole, the national economy was 2.40 in cognitive tasks. So both of our regions are above that level. That means it's showing that these are rich regions with a lot of highly skilled people doing complex jobs. And they're not very different, 2.58 and 2.61. What's interesting is the change. So two kinds of change you want to read. On the bottom line, you read that as we should expect, the economy as a whole has become less manual and more cognitive over time, right? That's the national economy. But look at the different performances of our two regions, right? San Francisco jumps way above the national average, and LA falls beneath it. So it's just another corroboration of the story we're telling about the general problem of the kinds of jobs that are being generated in these two regions get really different. The wages show it, the task intensity shows it. And now here's the other thing that comes out when you really look at how deep and broad the differences are. So this is college graduates. Now again, we would think that when we say college graduates, what that means is the economy should reward those skills. I have a college degree, you have a college degree, and if we basically have a college degree in the same subject, we should, roughly speaking, have the same level of wage wherever we go, because that's the skill we're using. And that used to be true, but it's not true anymore. There's a huge gap for people with this level of education between the two regions. But the same thing is true for non-natives, that's immigrants, right? Look at the huge gap that opens up in immigrant wages between our two regions. Now part of that is because there's a different composition of immigrants, meaning more Latinos in Southern California, more Asians in Northern. Asians generally come with higher levels of skills than Latinos. There's like a two or three generation skilling process for Latinos who mostly come out of rural areas and have low levels of education. However, it's true even when you get the skill levels. So in other words, let's say you take, this would be those immigrants who come with a college degree already. But the immigrant with a college degree does less well in Southern California than in Northern. And it would be the same if I stratify it by Asian, by Latino, by any group, no matter how you slice this pie, independently of personal characteristics, people will do better in this region than down south. I'm telling you a story you all want to hear, right? But the point, what it all comes back to though, is it's about the structure of opportunity more than the nature of people. It's what the people can do rather than their personal characteristics. And that I want to insist on. The mainstream story that you hear about cities today is it's all about the skills and the characteristics of the people. I'm actually reversing that. I'm telling you it's about the structure of opportunities. It's about the jobs that are available to them. People will rise to those opportunities if you give them. The question is, where do you land? Do you land in a region with opportunity or not? And the bottom line is, unequal as it is, the Bay Area offers much better opportunity. So what happened? Okay, so that's kind of like the descriptive part. And I think it sort of clears, you know, sort of shows you the evidence, but the question is why? What we did then, after we saw these numbers, we said, well, we really have to go in and look at the stories of how these regions, how they transition. And remember, you know, 1970 is another, it's a good date for another reason. It's pretty much what we call the dividing line between the old economy and the new economy, right? Old economy is post-war manufacturing, large firms, based on sort of like, you know, large-scale goods production. And 1970 is a break in two ways. It's the beginning of a high-speed finance economy and a high-speed high-tech economy. And it's also when globalization really gets going. Roughly in the 1970s is when we take off the controls on trade, on capital flows, and all that kind of stuff. So it's like the big break. And we didn't know it happening then, but we know it now looking backward, right? That's old economy, new economy. And what we find in looking at these two regions is you look at these core industries. You look at aerospace, IT, entertainment, finance, logistics, biotech, that essentially on the ground, that LA had a lot of resources in many of these sectors. In fact, it had astonishing human capital resources and very good firms. But it was something about their inability to grasp the way the new economy would organize firms and industries and what kinds of markets it would serve, that the firms in LA were unable to adapt to this. And I have a couple of stories that I'll tell you. So LA's decline, our basic story, is that its firms, its leadership groups, especially the Southern California Association of Governments and the Chamber of Commerce, they didn't get the new economy. They don't like it when I say this to them, but I'm more polite about it down south. But really, they didn't get it. And let me give you like a piece of evidence. We took the reports that were issued by the LA Economic Development Corporation, SCAG, and the Chamber. And I had my students basically read 30 years of their reports and analyze the content. That is, what are the phrases they use? What are they actually saying about the economy as it unfolds? And we compared them to what leadership organizations were doing up here. The Bay Area Council, for example, ABAG, but especially the Bay Area Council, and certain Silicon Valley groups. And you know, when my students, like, they started to do this work, and one of them burst into my office one day and he said, I can't believe this. By the early 1980s in the Bay Area, organizations here are already using the phrase new economy. And they're already saying, we have to look, we are too expensive to turn back the clock. We will not do big time manufacturing anymore. Our only way forward is to do highly skilled work with high tech. And in Southern California, they never do that, hardly even today. They keep talking about going back, being cheaper, lowering costs, lowering taxes, and getting manufacturing back. So there's this sharp divergence in the stories that are being told by the leadership of the two regions to their own people. It's like two different cultures are emerging, and 30 years ago this is happening. Now, there's another thing though. So beyond what they're saying, so we said, well, maybe that's just like, you know, people tell whatever story they want to tell, but what does that have to do with anything? Is there any reality behind it? And we decided to look into leadership networks in the two regions. So by leadership networks, we mean how does the top business leadership interact? And in economics and sociology these days, we have a very fashionable thing, which is we're into analyzing networks, meaning we want to see how people connect. And one way you can detect that is you see whether, for example, you take an individual and you see whether this individual is, what kind of organizations like boards of directors and so on they're on, and how many times they're on a board of directors or an organization with another individual, or how many people it takes to get from one organization to another. You can do all this stuff, you can measure all this stuff, right? I mean, I'm a wonky academic, I love this stuff. You know, you get crazy over the details, but so what we find though, and this is absolutely, I think you will see, astonishing, is that the two regions start out with roughly identical overall leadership structures. That is, the likelihood that some business leader will know another business leader in LA or is going to be pretty similar we did it for, I think, 1980 and 2010, is similar to that probability in the Bay Area. And we also measured connections between business leadership and major philanthropic organizations like foundations and community organizations, major non-governmental organizations. To kind of see, like, what's the structure of people knowing and connecting with each other? Okay, now have a look at this. So this is San Francisco in 2010. Don't even look at the details, just like imprint the image, and then look at that. Right? Just contrast. There it is, right? Kind of in a nutshell, there's a fragmented region, and there's a connected region. And these are what we call comparable samples of companies. And moreover, this is true not only, this is sort of all the major industries together, but it also occurs within industries. So if you take, for example, the IT sector in Southern California, people know each other less than within the IT sector here. Or you take the healthcare sector, people know each other more here inside that across companies than they do in the healthcare sector in Southern California. It just shows up again and again. And it shows up in another way. So, my friends here at the Bay Area Council, this is the proof that you are probably the best, you are the best leadership organization. I'm going to make my hosts happy, but this is, I swear this was, you know, we did not know this when we started this project. What this does is it network and analyzes the connections of leadership organizations to these business and social networks in the regions. And it tells you, I'm not going to go into the detail of what's called the in-betweenness statistic. That's an academic thing. Basically, it tells you how many interconnections you get to by going through two people in a network. So the higher the number, the more connected. And the key thing you can take away from this is that the most connected organization in Southern California has an index, that's the LA Chamber of Commerce, has an index that is less than a third that of the Bay Area Council. It is reaching through its network less than 1/3 of the key players in its region that the council does here. And the other thing that's, I think, really sharply in evidence here is notice that after the chamber, there's nothing in Southern California. Whereas after the Bay Area Council is extraordinary, but three of the other organizations there are as good as the top organization in Southern California. And again, the book has what you would call nauseating detail on these things to prove it academically. I'm quite sure of this conclusion. Okay, so we have evidence then that there really is some difference in the networking of these two regions, which is, by the way, my major point here. So what happens? How did networking make a difference? Well, if you look back at the history of the two regions, you get actually LA is really well positioned. In other words, if we're standing there in 1970 and you're making a guess about IT and you're making a guess about the semiconductor revolution, I think this is an important point because looking forward, it's really hard to make guesses about economies. There's incredible uncertainty looking into the future. So LA was really well situated. It had amazing companies, it had a technological base, an engineering base. The biggest manufacturers of semiconductors in the 60s were in Southern California. However, the first internet message was sent from Leonard Kleinrock's computer at UCLA, not from up here. But what happened? Of course, we know they got lazy about commercialization because they had a luxury defense market. That's one thing that I think that made them go to sleep. They could make these really fancy semiconductors that would be for guidance systems and so on. And of course, and they had no influences basically to teach them new ways of doing the tech business. This is a story we're going to see in a second. LA's tech was there, but it wasn't put to good uses. What happened here in the Bay Area? Well, first of all, let's remember HP, they were there since 1938. And they were very similar to their Southern California counterparts. They had federal government clients, and Hewlett and Packard were, they were tied into the defense establishment and the old engineering culture. They were very good at it, but they weren't so different from their many counterparts in Southern California. So what happened? Of course, we know that Fairchild, HP, and Xerox, they saw opportunities in commercialization. But the question is why? Like, what is it that made them click on to this new way of doing tech? And none of those smart people in Southern California did. Well, the story that we are pretty convinced about was that there was a lucky thing called Xerox PARC here in Northern California, Palo Alto Research Center. And we had a long conversation with Paul Duguid at Berkeley, who was at PARC at the time. He's a professor now. And he said something very astonishing, which we first didn't believe. He said, the thing about Xerox PARC was that it wasn't just like a lab. It was a place where all these weird people would come together. He used the phrase weird. He said, there were we had a lot of engineering types, but he said, but there was a huge influence from these other elements of Bay Area culture. The Berkeley types were there too, not just the Stanford types. So you had the engineers and you had the more kind of wild scientists from Berkeley, but also you had a mix from the basically the appropriate technology crowd and the environmentalists. Now that sounds a little flaky as a story, and we decided to investigate it, and we started piling up evidence that it was true. Duguid gave us names of who was at Xerox PARC, and you can follow their biographies, and you can see that in fact it was a very interesting place. And then we happened across Steve Jobs' famous speech at Stanford in 2005, and if you want to check this one out, it's absolutely fascinating. You go right to the end, the last 2 minutes of the speech on YouTube, and what does he say? He says, so if I really want to sum up what inspired me and what really got me into this business, it was the Whole Earth Catalog. I don't know how many people in the room know what the Whole Earth Catalog is, right? I see a few people nodding. So the Whole Earth Catalog was the Bible of the appropriate technology movement here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it was a manual, a large format printed manual in the late 60s that was about technology, and it was about what they, again, appropriate technology. It was about beauty, simplicity, and usefulness. And it came out of this kind of new agey culture in the Bay Area. And Steve Jobs, he makes a big deal in his speech about, he said, that's why I wanted to do the Macintosh. It's because I wanted to do an IT version of the Whole Earth Catalog. And then, so we said, okay, well, people tell stories. How much do you really want to, is this flaky? But the evidence keeps piling up. We interviewed Jaron Lanier, who's, some of you may, I don't know, anyone know who he is? Right, okay. So, he has, again, he's been in the story for a long time. And in his 2 books, he has lengthy explanations of this phenomenon, of the mixing of different kinds of people through networks that interconnected in the Bay Area early on in the IT revolution. And there are other books. Annalise Aksedian from Berkeley wrote a book in 1994 where she made a similar argument to ours. I'm not claiming to invent anything. It's sometimes you rediscover truths in this business. And Anna said the reason that the Bay Area got ahead of Boston, they had like LA, Boston had great technological endowments, but they didn't know what to do with them. They couldn't do entrepreneurship. They couldn't imagine a new world like people in the Bay Area began to imagine a new world with this tech. That's why Silicon Valley hasn't died. Silicon Valley keeps pumping out the innovation because it keeps pulling in new ideas and finding them the resources to become something. And the reverse happened in LA. The reverse happened is that LA never had those kind of networks. It was fragmented then, and it is fragmented. It's actually more fragmented now. But of course, the Bay Area Council, once again, saw that early, interestingly enough. We went through the history of the Bay Area Council. LA never got an inclusive leadership coalition. It never got inclusive business groups. LA has a fragmented social structure. So the engineers, they never got to talk to any new aging people in LA. You had to do it up here. And as a result, the engineers stayed in their box. And they had a good business going. And as a result, they missed out on the revolution. So, now, biotech is exactly the same story several decades later. That's what's fascinating. The science for gene splicing, it actually emerges simultaneously and in cooperation between UCSF, that's Cohen and Wire, right, and the City of Hope Hospital in Duarte, right, that's Riggs and Itacuria, at the same time. And at the time, most people were thinking that LA would become the biotech capital of the world. So Boyer attempts, actually he started his first startup in LA. He wasn't going to do the entrepreneurship up here, right? And one of the things he started was Amgen. Now, the board, as they set it up, was actually shared between people from Caltech, UCLA, and UCSB. And they set up, and they had all kinds of big breakthroughs in the 80s. And they set up their headquarters as kind of a weird decision. They set it up exactly at the kind of the midpoint between these three places in a suburb called Thousand Oaks in the West San Fernando Valley, otherwise known as the middle of nowhere. Okay, and that's an important part of the story. It's a typical LA error, right? Instead of maximizing connection, you maximize distance. Physical distance in this case, but it turns out to be social and organizational distance, right? But guess what happens next? Amgen is the first successful biotech company, and it immediately becomes a typical old economy firm. What I mean there is, in as early as 1983, the scientists are excluded from Amgen's management. They do the earliest IPO. Everybody says, you're really successful. They get a huge blob of funding from Chicago. The management comes in from Chicago, and they turn it into a big standalone firm in a distant suburb. What happens, of course, is Wire retreats back to the Bay Area. He teams up with people from the IT world, whose names I'm blanking on right now. There's this famous young guy that he's working with who comes out of the IT milieu. It's in the book. And he creates a new kind of firm. He says, I'm not going to do an Amgen. Genentech will be different. Genentech, he says, we were going to keep the scientists on the board of directors. Scientists are going to be not only scientists, they're going to be managers. Because the managers need to be keep up being shook up by the people who are on the front lines of innovation. And Genentech model is rapidly imitated in the Bay Area. What happens is it has a lot of little baby Genentechs. So what happens is in biotech and life sciences is that another network is established in the Bay Area, right? So Bay Area does not have a big hit in biotech like Amgen, but many biotech firms. And in this case, smaller really is better. So the result is that you get science-based capitalism essentially invented here, or 21st century version of it, here in the Bay Area, right? And you get a big cluster versus one standalone firm in LA, right? There are deep and wide science-based entrepreneurial networks in the Bay Area. We have counts of it. What I mean is, you can count the number of times that people are in a firm, they start up another firm, how much they've worked with someone in a different firm, and how, in other words, how what we call invisible colleges. There's networks of people who worked with each other in previous experiences. These networks are now deep and wide in the Bay Area. I believe the number is 9 times bigger than in LA or something like that. So the same thing is now true of entrepreneurship in general. You get the overall levels of people starting up firms are similar in our two regions. You get a lot of people starting up firms. The question is, what do you do to make them survive and grow and be innovative? And the difference, of course, is networks. The Bay Area rate of having worked with another entrepreneur as a co-manager or a scientist, this is what I was saying a minute ago, having worked with an entrepreneur are 9 times denser in the Bay Area compared to greater LA. Bay Area has these kind of, they're like invisible structures of people knowing each other. And so when something needs to happen, people know who to call, and they have people they can trust. I'm not saying it's all warm and cuddly here, I know it's not, right? But we're just saying that human networks are really what makes change, and especially innovative change, makes it more probable in a short period of time. So this also intersects with those network measures we did of having a greater range of contacts. People here know people in more different industries as well as within their own. So that's the story, really. The barriers are simply much greater in SoCal. Okay, so here's really where I want to get to. What's the watch list? No, I think Jim said this. No one can stay on top forever by doing the same thing. It's a weird thing to say in a region that is so prosperous and so just sort of uncontestably leader in the world of tech today. But we must remind ourselves other regions have been in this position before. Nothing is forever, and it's when you're strong that it's a good time to think about what might be peaking. So I think, I can't say for sure. We know, of course, that huge waves of new tech are coming. We know that 10 years from now, the world's going to look very different. And we also know that new tech is very geographically specific. Great new technologies, they get captured in, there are 2 or 3 first mover regions at most for great new waves of technology. History shows this very clearly. They only spread out later on. So the hit comes, the first few decades, if you can be a first mover, you get very rich. And if you lose out on them, you'll never become a first mover region. These are just the rules of economic geography. They're very deterministic, but everyone imagines, for example, look at this. For the last 30 years, everyone's imagined they could imitate Silicon Valley, and hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent all over the years trying to do it, and everybody failed. Because you can't do it. Too late is too late. So that's kind of like really the hardcore of it, right? I mean, I tell this to local economic development officials all the time. They don't know where I believe you because everyone wants to believe they can do it. But they're basically wasting money. Okay, so here's what we know. You all know this. Bay Area high tech is maturing, right? It's necessary, especially in anything to do with the big hardware or cloud side of things. It's maturing. It's a big corporate sector now. That's great. It's an amazing success story. But it's potentially a danger to future creativity. This is at least the story of other cities. Again, I am not a soothsayer, but my instincts tell me that this is the danger moment. The danger moment comes at the moment of greatest corporate success, just like it did for Detroit, and in previous periods, just like it did for New York. And it happened in LA in the 1950s. In retrospect, we know LA locked it in 1957, and then started going down because it locked. So the old days of creation may be giving way to the new days of acquisition and consolidation. And in the long run, big companies have a world market. And I hate to say it, there's no personal criticism of anyone, but big companies are never loyal to regions. They're rational, and they're world players, right? The local is where they start, but they don't stay necessarily. Now, technology matures, price comes to matter more, the Bay Area is expensive. It's just, that's going to peak. Now, the good news we know is that in every previous wave of this, Silicon Valley has regenerated itself. We're in Silicon Valley 7.0 now. So there's absolutely no reason to be depressed or fatalistic about it, but to watch the evolution of the structure, right? So, what do we have to do? Obviously, support science and technology. That's a no-brainer. But I think if I were going to say, everybody wants to support science and technology in the world today. Here, in Europe, in Japan, in China. So this is something everybody's doing. What is the Bay Area's unique advantage? The Bay Area's unique advantage is its networks. And if you want to separate that out, the Bay Area has smart people, a lot of other regions have smart people. The Bay Area has good science, more and more regions have good science. But the key Bay Area advantage is these networks and the human experience that is built up in mixing it up, lashing it up, and making resources come together so that new ideas can get acted upon. They don't even have to necessarily be invented here. So, an inclusive conversation to keep those networks going and make sure that they don't freeze up, and frankly, that they don't become too hierarchical and corporate. because in the past, when the networks come to be the ones inside corporations, rather than the regional environment in general, that's when the region changes from being a super entrepreneurial region into being a kind of corporate big actor one. And again, you can get a couple decades out of that, but you don't get much more than that out of it. That's what history shows. So, it's the networks, right? And the networks, I keep, people in Southern California ask me, well, what can we do? What's the policy measure? You know, what's the button to push and the money to spend? And my answer is I have the luxury of doing this as an academic, right? It's kind of my job. I say it's really about a conversation, meaning it is, first of all, knowing what the problem is, really having a realistic economic, geographical sense of what are the rules of economic development, where do we stand in it, and what's our problem. And I think that, and about the networks, the only way to build them is actually to get the people, as they say metaphorically, around the table and to make sure the conversations start to happen. It has to be a conversation that is solidly among the leadership, but it also means the leadership has to make sure it's open to other groups and to, we might say, the aspirers, right? So it can't just be the elite talking to itself. I mean, that can get you so far. We used to have that in LA. It was called the Committee of 20. The problem is they only talk to themselves. They didn't talk to any entrepreneurs. So they can talk and they can build bridges and stuff like that, but they're not going to get entrepreneurs unless they make sure the networks are porous, inclusive, right, and very widespread, and they have to be regional, not local. So that's the story. Make sure that kind of fragmentation and, we might say, freezing doesn't happen in the Bay Area, and make sure the networks keep getting renewed, even though I think the temptation is to say, you know, we've got all these world-class corporations here, you know, they'll take care of us. I'm not saying they're bad-willed, right? It's just that they do what they do. So it's, again, I would say it's actually keeping more of, I'll put it a little kind of polemically, it's keeping some of the old Bay Area mixed into the new Bay Area, because the old Bay Area is actually going to make a new Bay Area come around. So that's a vague suggestion, but I hope it at least provokes some discussion, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Storper, and fascinating talk. And I think if you are now a member of the Bay Area Council, hopefully Dr. Storper's pitch will convince you.
I'll ask him for my check later, you know, for the messaging.
No money was exchanged.
That's right.
We got a little bit of a late start, but I wanted to, and I'm not sure if this microphone is working or if we even need it, but certainly wanted to give an opportunity to have you ask a few questions. And we have Lenny Mendoza will take the microphone first.
Great talk and love the book, so well done. I have a comment and then a question for you. The comment was that in 1990, when the Bay Area Council Economic Institute was formed, part of the reason was a view that LA was kicking San Francisco's butt and losing businesses to LA. So sometimes that competition is healthy both ways. So it's nice to be on top, but I'd rather be the underdog, trying to figure out a way to get there. My question was, what's the response been in LA when you're talking about this now? It's great to be talking to people who you're applauding. What are the people who you're concerned about saying?
That's an interesting, I'm surprised actually in LA. There's I would say, you know, two kinds of reaction. There's been some defensiveness. For example, a couple of organizations have you know, tried to come back and say it's not really what you say it is, it's not as bad, but those numbers I think we have are quite solid, and it's a bit of resistance on the part of SCAG because we are, without any animus, we're quite critical of them just because we think they missed the boat. They didn't have the right, they really didn't have the right belief structure. They looked backward rather than forward. What I am surprised at though is that I think we hit a nerve in the sense that people recognize that Southern California, it's not a basket case, but it's stagnant economically in terms of it should be doing much better, and that this is now a kind of an evident problem. So the good thing I think is there's some willingness to have a conversation. I'm very happy about doing that. I don't know, you know, kind of whether everyone's going to line up with my analysis, but I think many people are lining up on the diagnosis.
Yeah, let's see. How do we? Go ahead.
You mentioned networks and intermixing. I was wondering if you could speak briefly about the importance of the Bay Area establishing the Bay Area Rapid Transit Network in the 50s, 60s, and then what you see as the importance of transportation for continuing the ability to stay interconnected.
So this is actually a thing that you're actually sitting next to another great economic geographer, Dick Walker from Berkeley, who I owe a lot to. But we think a lot actually about issues of regionalism, and also regionalism, sort of how it intersects with what we might call, I'll use sort of just a word like the personality of a region or the kind of DNA of a region. And the story, you probably know, the story of rapid transit in LA and San Francisco is astonishingly different in the sense that way back at the time when BART was first proposed, there was a proposal in LA called LARC. And both regions went to Sacramento for seed funding. And when it worked its way through the local political system, LA actually turned that money down and said, we're not interested in that. The LA City Council said, public transit is socialism, we don't want to touch it. The Bay Area history is a convoluted one, right, involving a lot of knocking of heads together, notably getting the East Bay and the city to cooperate and the role of Cyril Magnan and all that stuff. But the bottom line is that the Bay Area has a history of what we might call, it's kind of like rivalrous and squabbling, but nonetheless, bottom line, a certain amount of regional problem solving. And I actually think part of that is simply because you've got a bay. If you don't cross it here, and the bay is surrounded by all these different political jurisdictions. So there's almost like a paradox. This more fragmented region that has a geographical barrier in the middle of it, in a way, it can only function if you learn how to make deals. LA, we interviewed people in Southern California, and they repeatedly used the phrase, the problem with it is that we don't want to deal with the city or the county of LA, it's the big dog on the block and we don't trust them. That's a phrase that the people in Orange County use. So we came to the conclusion, actually, there's almost a paradox, that in the old days, LA had these big counties and big cities, and they just went and did what they wanted to do. You build a port, you shove an airport down the throat of anyone you want, you build water where you want it. It was imperial LA. But once LA kind of matured, the problem was not LA being imperial anymore, but talking to itself and cooperating. And it never had this device of absolutely having to deal with its own obstacles. So what happens in the Bay Area is it's another divergence story. LA, basically, it gets built out, and there's no incentive for anyone to develop more means of cooperation. In the Bay Area, it's not because you all like each other so much, but because you have to, or there won't be bridges. So, and same thing with BART, right? So I think what happened is that over time, there was something like different learning curves that happened in the two regions. And they built up, I think the governments here, squabbling as they are, they do better than ours do at talking to one another. By the way, just one other detail. The last big project we did in Southern California was called the Alameda Quarter. Okay, Alameda Quarter is a high-speed train link between the ports and downtown LA. And everybody said, yeah, see, we're back. We did this really amazing infrastructure to get the China trade. But the problem is it was successful as technology. It was an absolute disaster for politics. Because what happened was all the cities that weren't the city of LA, between LA and Long Beach, and there's a whole bunch of it, it's like a working class corridor, right? When they got, as it were, uppity and told Long Beach and the city of LA that they wanted to actually have a voice in this project and structure it and have some community benefits, you know what the city of LA did? They kicked them off the board. They restructured the board and built the project and then said, now we'll tell you what we're going to give you, but you don't really count. So it's that old story of just, you sort of like, you just basically hammer people, right? But you never learn about cooperation. And it's a long story in LA, that kind of really hardcore aggressive politics that leads to blockage.
Let's go back here.
I'm struck by your definition of diversity under an economic meaning. I've never seen that before, and so opens a new dimension for me. I want to talk, get your reaction to what some perceive as a bit of a barbell economy, where we have extremely highly knowledgeable, high-income workers on one end, which all regions seem to compete for and want to exalt. And on the other hand, you have very low-skilled, low-end service-related jobs. And there seems to be a lack of permeability between the classes that is becoming even more and more entrenched up here in the Bay Area. What happens if we're not able to create greater transit in sort of economic access in terms of people being able to move up and down the scale for our future and trying to repopulate and evergreen these networks?
I think I'm as worried about this problem as you are, and I think it's a national, if not an international problem. We're at a phase in the development of our economy where inequalities are growing, but again, it's not a Bay Area problem. It's a problem, it's a grave national problem. In this book, we take on a kind of a limited aspect of it, which is, the two regions are, like I said, equally unequal. They both have this structure. It's just that one of them we might say has a bigger, more successful sort of high wage core, and this is an unpopular thing to say, but there is some trickle down of benefits in the Bay Area. I mean, we see it, because we see that at every level, people actually have higher incomes here. But it doesn't obviate the problem you're talking about, which is an economy which is concentrating income and wealth like this, whatever the region may be, whether it's LA or New York or the Bay Area, we clearly have problems for our future. Again, this book, because it's based on comparing two regions, frankly, it doesn't solve that problem. It doesn't have particular insights into what to do about that, except to say a double whammy for LA is it's both unequal and not very successful.
Let's take one more question, and then we have some wine and some food we'd like you to enjoy, and obviously the chance to talk with Dr. Storper individually too in that sense. Let's take one more question here. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. My question and comment, I guess, is not unlike the last one. Like you, I'm an academic, and I'm a native of Detroit, and a summer job at Ford, leading tours through the Ford Rouge plant, got me through college, paved the way for a long career after that, and certainly was an access for my family, the middle class. Detroit, I'd like to hear you say more, if you can, in a few minutes about Detroit's experience and here, because for all of the mistakes that evidently were made in Detroit's experience, a vibrant middle class was created there, and I don't see that happening here. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
So, I mean, the story of Detroit, and like I mentioned that other comparison, that of say Detroit and Boston. Okay, if we go back to the middle of the 20th century. Look, I think the ingredients of Detroit's failure are many, but some of them are classical, meaning you've got an industry, the car industry, so it becomes a one-horse town. By the way, a bit of a danger for the Bay Area in terms of tech. You've got an overwhelming, this industry becomes very successful and powerful. It's got a few big companies, and it's in a maturing tech sector. And then these companies, like I say, they have their roots in Detroit, but no big companies, they're not there to be loyal to regions, they're there to do business, right? And they will look, especially when they're faced with competition, as they became, they have to reduce their costs. And then what happens is they start to reduce their commitment to the region because they don't need to locate there anymore. That's step number one. But that's not necessarily fatal, because people who study Detroit, it's very much like Silicon Valley today or LA in the 20s. Detroit was this, like Philadelphia by the way, was this amazing source of technological innovation and entrepreneurialism. Detroit was the hotbed, along with actually Cleveland and Cincinnati, of mechanical engineering in the United States for decades. And so the issue is what happened when the main sort of what became the big firm core started to sort of say, we're going to go other places, we're mature now, is that something stopped there from being kind of a new entrepreneurial process, a new spin-off process to take up where the big corporations were leaving off. And I think there's a lot of stories there. Some are similar to LA, meaning the attention was kind of diverted by the fact that the big three looked so powerful and interesting and the good jobs were there. Another, I think, for the city of Detroit, and this is not the whole metro area, but clearly the city of Detroit and certain of the kind of core suburbs is, this is America, we have to talk about it, but there was really serious racial conflict. And what it did is, I think, it tore the city administrations apart so that their attention, and I think rightfully so, was taken up with trying to address social conflict, and mostly based on the very bad racial history. And what happened is, it had kind of like an effect of, first of all, there's only so much attention that government can, there's only so many things at any moment that government can do. We saw this in LA in the 90s. LA was absorbed with basically, we had the Rodney King events, we had a disastrous police department, we had waves of low-wage immigration. And at that time, it's like everyone said, every time you suggested, let's do something about the economy, let's rebuild LA or save the aerospace industry, it came and went in a matter of months because there were like immediate social conflicts and crises to deal with. And Detroit got into that cycle. And so there wasn't anyone in public leadership that could deal with the economy. And the economy is that frog in the boiling water thing, right? It happens slowly. And by the time you get around to it, it's usually too late. So there's that, and the corporations, I think they said, look, we'd like to stay here, but like the public administration is deteriorating, the whole public sector is a mess. This is like not a fun place to do business anymore. And then you, of course, had within the various other community groups who could have been participants, say the labor unions, they're under pressure because their jobs are going away. And so you get the perfect storm. And it really is about networks, and it's about leadership and networks and vision. It just got pushed out of the way by all the problems that by the time they're there, you don't have the space to deal with them anymore. The story in Boston, by the way, I think is an untold one or less told one. I don't think he ever got credit for it, but Mike Dukakis in 1983, he put together what's called the Massachusetts Growth Cabinet, the governor's growth cabinet. And he saw that Detroit was in trouble and everyone was fighting with each other. But what he did was he brought the university people, he brought the tech people, and he brought especially the working communities together who were very alienated. Boston had the whole racial conflict thing. It had a working population that was like, all those Harvard people, we don't like to talk to them, and this tech thing out in Route 128, we don't like that. This typical thing. But what Dukakis did is he literally brought them to the same table. And at a moment when I think Boston could have gone down the drain, he was the one who, as it were, started the conversation again. So I kind of return to that same point, which is we're talking about economics, but actually we're talking about society here. That's where I come down. Beneath an economy, it's a question of what kinds of networks you have that enable the problem-solving conversations to happen, or the converse, the downside of that is, when do you get into situations where those conversations can't happen anymore? And I think that's the Detroit story.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Storper.